Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, Erin Axelrod here, a partner worker owner at Lift Economy. And I'm so pleased to be joined today on the podcast, Next Economy Now, with Emily Musil. Emily, PhD, is a Managing Director at Milken Institute Strategic Philanthropy, where she leads the environment and social innovation portfolio and innovation competitions. Musil spent over a decade in academia, where as a college professor, she specialized in African history, global development, and human rights. She then joined the X Prize Foundation, overseeing a suite of prizes and initiatives as the executive director of the human equity domain. Musil has a PhD and MA from UCLA, graduated with honors from Drew University, and was a Fulbright Hays Scholar. She is a public speaker and serves on the board of trustees of Drew University. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'm really happy to be here today.
Well, I got a chance to look over the report, which I'm sure we'll get into, that was just released by the Milken Institute. But before we dive in, I'd love to hear from you. I just shared sort of a pathway that you took to get here to the work you're doing today, but tell me anything else about what brings you to climate work, what brings you to the Milken Institute, what's alive for you this morning?
Great. Well, thank you for that question. I mean, that's actually the simple questions are often the most complex. So I think in general, it's a combination of growing up in a family that always cared about the environment and what's happening to communities around us. And in the work I did with my previous career, really looking at global trends and how people react to whatever society they're in. The climate and the environment of that place is an essential way to understand how people experience their life, what food they have access to, what sort of air they can breathe, all sorts of social outcomes for people. Once I came to the Milken Institute, a couple of things. One, we have one project that's focused on sub-Saharan Africa. So a major project that every year we run a series of technology competitions that are all for solutions by and for sub-Saharan Africa. All of the solutions are tested in sub-Saharan Africa. And as we were looking at the main challenges there, climate is through everything. So we looked at something for smallholder farmers. It was really essential to say, how are people able to grow more food, and questions of mitigation versus adaptation with their solutions. We did something on off-grid green energy. So really figuring out alternative forms of energy and how that's important. The second piece is, as we talk to philanthropists here in our network at the Milken Institute, we realized that while less than 2% of philanthropic giving goes to climate and environmental causes, a lot of people, when you talk to them, really care about the planet, whether that's nature around them, conservation, healthy food for their families and communities. And a lot of philanthropists just didn't know where to get started. So that was really what started us building out this program for philanthropists here at the Milken Institute.
And so you use the word program. It's not just this report that was released in February, but it's a program. Could you talk a little bit more about the services and the elements of that program for philanthropy?
Well, first, let me back up for a second for our listeners who don't know the Milken Institute. So we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. right now. We have offices around the world, however. We're really focused on how do you get measurable progress for a meaningful life. And that's for people around the world. And that's a little bit philosophical. The way we do that, we really look at how do the financial, physical, mental, and environmental factors affect the health of someone so that they can have a meaningful life. So we bring together ideas and resources to really help as people are accelerating that pathway. We're organized primarily into financial work, health work, and strategic philanthropy. So I sit in the strategic philanthropy pillar. But really, the Milken Institute overall has a suite of climate programming. So it's not just the work, this report that I'm going to speak to right now. So there's all sorts of things on climate financing. We have a feeding change program that's really focused on food systems. We've done all sorts of work bringing people together to think through various climate, environment, and sustainability issues. So that's sort of, the program is writ large across the Institute. Where I sit in philanthropy, we're really looking at how we can talk to individual philanthropists, foundations, corporate philanthropies, and really help them think through how they best have the most impactful use of their philanthropic dollars. We care about philanthropic dollars for lots of reasons, but particularly what people don't necessarily think about with philanthropy is this is a sort of capital that can operate differently than other forms of capital. So especially when it comes to environmental issues, somebody can just write a check and the money is there. So it can be really quick. It can be nimble. It also can be really patient on the other side of the coin. So that means it's not waiting for an immediate quarterly return or something the way some other capital might work. And it's really something that people tend to do when they care about the impact of that capital. For us, we really want to inspire more philanthropists and philanthropic giving towards environmental and climate issues, and to really figuring out how do we help direct that capital.
Yeah, and I love that you use the phrasing, it can be patient, it can be nimble and quick, because the crux of it that you just named is to direct it there, to get folks and philanthropists over the hump, to actually make those gifts, get that money into active utilization out in the world, not in the endowment or not in the bank accounts of the philanthropies themselves. That's the challenge, right?
Yes.
So how are you addressing that?
Well, we have all sorts of ways that we think about, and we actually do programs that kind of can help to actually move that capital out of bank accounts into programming. So a few things, like one trend we've been noticing is a lot of philanthropists are really eager to work together with other philanthropists. So things like funder collaboratives, where people can say, hey, can we all chip in or figure out if this thing works? And a lot of philanthropists are looking for peers to look through what are the ways we're evaluating what is impactful or not. On the other side of it, you've got people who are trying to figure out, how do we navigate getting access to capital, and how can it be a little bit more accessible, particularly when you're looking more at the local level? You know, there can be a lot of paperwork and other things that go into getting funding. I'm sure we'll get to the report in a little bit, but as a preview, we do have 10 main recommendations that are in the report. And one of those, specifically to philanthropists, is asking them to really think about different types of philanthropy that they may want to use. So meaning, what are different financial models? Whether that is more trust-based, where you're not saying you must do exactly this, the other thing. It's saying, you all are the experts. You're out in the field. You're, the ones doing it. So we're going to give you this access to capital. So really a trust-based model. Things I mentioned before about like a funder collaborative, more unrestricted funding. That's a lot of things we hear from people looking for philanthropic capital, that the more you restrict the money, the harder it is for people to really operate and to iterate quickly. Other things that aren't necessarily traditional philanthropy, venture philanthropy is something a lot of people are more interested in, and even impact investing. So some people really want to make an investment. If it's a company, there may be some sort of a return, but it's different than your regular investment because they're doing it primarily as a social good. So there's all sorts of different philanthropic tools and models that we use and recommend.
And I love that kind of menu of options kind of meets funders where they're at and allows them to adapt to what might feel comfortable for the trustees. And I actually, after I used the word comfortable, I kind of challenged myself. Well, we can't just have people feeling comfortable. There's frontline communities on the ground that are not comfortable because the climate crisis is hitting them front and center. So let's have philanthropists join in that discomfort, because ultimately this is something that, whereas the frontline communities are getting hit the first and worst, we know that no one's immune to this. We're all on one planet affected by these extreme weather events, flooding, food systems costs that you mentioned in the report. So just thank you for that menu of options, which can reduce the friction for philanthropists to really find the type of agreement that can work for their board of trustees as a way to move them more and more towards partnership.
For sure. And, I'll say, because we spend so much time with people who are really trying to figure out how to give, it's actually really heartening to know how many people really want their money to have impact. They're looking to understand what to do. People want to give. They want to have change. They want it to change lives. So that's where we feel a lot of responsibility where we sit to really figure out how to be a bridge between the needs on the frontline communities and the people who want to give. They are sometimes overwhelmed by literally tens of thousands of organizations that they're trying to figure out, well, why should it be this one or that one? Should I give small amounts to lots of organizations or one big check to one organization? Really sorting through that. So much need in the world. You could give and figure out, but not necessarily know where is this going to make the most difference. We have found something, not surprisingly, I'm saying this like this is like hot off the press, but when people actually talk to each other, when you get people in the room, people who are doing the work, the frontline communities, as you say, talking to bigger nonprofits that are doing the work, talking to philanthropists and investors, and really having a conversation so they can understand each other. That's something we really try to facilitate. And I will say the other piece of it that perhaps you could have some of my colleagues on the show another time to speak more to some of the financial modeling. I mean, we do financial innovation labs. We do climate financing, work with COP, or we're setting up the pathway to Brazil right now. So we're trying to operate at all these various levels. Like, what are the things we need to do at a really large scale to finance things? And what can an individual philanthropist who's just one person saying, how can I help? So it's really a huge range where we're trying to say, how do these pieces fit together and how can we get this desperately needed change?
A word that comes to mind is empathy. Just bringing people in the room so that we can empathize from different perspectives can often yield to better outcomes in terms of tangible partnerships that are funded and that sort of thing. And also for practitioners on the ground, having more empathy for where the philanthropists are, the questions they're asking can often reduce the amount of time spent making requests for money in different places, right? Because we're really understanding the needs and tailoring our time and attention to those. I want to get into the report. So I'd love to have you share, first off, who did you interview? There were, I think, 70 institutions total. And so who was represented in that? How did those folks get selected? And what were some of the questions you asked?
Yeah, so for every project that the Milken Institute does, we want to make sure as part of our research that we are speaking to experts. And internally, for a little bit of jargon, we really talk about people as key opinion leaders rather than necessarily experts, because who does somebody determine is an expert in something? So we want to make sure that when we're talking about experts, we're clear that this means people who are experiencing whatever the problem is we are trying to solve. I mentioned before that we're nonpartisan, so we really try to make sure that everything we do, we're talking to people across the political spectrum, depending on the topic. And for something like climate, certainly this would be the case. We talk across national borders to try to get a global perspective, generational, sector. So there's a whole matrix of ways that we want to make sure we are getting a big picture about what's happening. We also convene people for this part of this report. We brought together people in person, also at our offices, after we'd done a lot of research to kind of stress test some of the ideas. There were three main questions that were sort of the pillar of any interview. The first was really, very generally, where does this person think that philanthropy can have the biggest impact on climate and environmental issues? So that's just from their perspective, wherever they sit. And some were funders, some were recipients, some were activists, some were policymakers, some were investors, all sorts, some were researchers. The second was, what do people see happening too much of when they're giving towards a particular issue? So what do we have too much of? And then the third will not surprise you. What is not happening enough? So we wanted to make sure we get there, just at least those 3 basic questions answered throughout. What was surprising, this does not always happen with every research project. What was surprising was that without prompting specifically, we weren't saying, do you think X is the most important environmental issue or something like that? We were really just asking that open-ended question. And we really saw these same themes coming up again and again. So we ended up, I mentioned earlier, we had 10 categories or 10 recommendations. Those 10 recommendations really fell into these 3 categories. It was, how do you set your strategy? So how are you really figuring out how to get started? The second was, how do you operate in that ecosystem? So I think that's some of your previous point about empathy and community building, talking to people. The third was about engaging stakeholders. So when we went through, we were really emphasizing for people things about cultivating partnerships that strengthen capacity. Don't just assume things. Make sure you're asking. You're in constant communication. I mentioned earlier things like different philanthropic models, trust-based philanthropy. So there really is communication that is woven throughout this. At the same time, we also talk about data being essential. That's something that we heard a lot of. And I do want to set the stage for some of your listeners, because I'm sure some of you have been doing this sort of work for a long, long, long time. And our main audience for this particular report was people who were coming to us saying either, so much of the climate work is too technical, I'm not a scientist, I don't really understand how to engage in this, or people who said, this feels so big, I just don't know where to get started. So this is much more for that particular funder. So that was how the report got started. Those were questions that we asked. We ended up also finding 4 main areas that we think that we found from the research really could use more philanthropic giving. And before I say this, I do want to say to everybody listening, because I have such a climate-focused audience, all of it needs funding. Okay. Everything does. Yeah, I said at the front end, it is less than 2% of philanthropic giving, which just seems insane when we all live on this planet together. But within that, so that said, the 4 main areas that we thought could really use philanthropic work, first is around deforestation. So this one, for lots of reasons, why addressing deforestation. 2, food systems, which you just mentioned a moment ago. That's about 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. There's food manufacturing, food waste, et cetera. The third is oceans. There's so much work in oceans, whether that's sustainable fisheries, cargo ship emissions, restoring coastal habitats, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of things with the ocean. And then finally, since those all seem like things you can hold and understand, a tree, food, ocean, the 4th one that came up was communications and public engagement. So this is a really different type of thing, but we heard this over and over again, that people were saying there's not really consensus on what we should do. Or every time people talk about anything with the environment, it is, well, we're all going to die, or there's nothing, the time's running out, it is now. We could have lots of commentary about that. But at the end of the day, if you want to get people involved, really thinking about, how do we get public sector champions? How do we get messaging out for people to figure out why they should care, how they can take action? So that messaging part turned out to be over and over something that we heard in addition to specific areas. So that was sort of that. I'd say that one was the biggest surprise of the main key areas we heard around giving.
So tell me a little bit more about then how in that surprise area, how you grappled with that to produce those insights, and tell me any more insights from the report that you'd like to highlight for our listeners.
Sure. I'm happy to walk through the 10 and on a very high level, if that's useful. The first one was really, number 1, breaking complex issues down. So, I mentioned before, people, they look at, they're like, it's everything. It's the food you eat, the air you breathe, the clothes you put on your body, everything, microplastics, it's everywhere. It's all the things. So if you just break it down and look at one specific thing at a time, so people don't get quite so overwhelmed, and make it something that's really accessible to people. Related, number 2 was, don't try to check too many boxes. So this is, that can kind of hinder progress when people are like, well, we need to do all 50 of these things. let's try to make progress. Our mission is around measurable progress. What can we know we can measure? And we're going to set out to say, this is the thing we're going to do. So here's a specific topic, and here's something that we can march forward on.
And just to pause,
sure.
Again, these are 10 recommendations for those specific audience groups that you mentioned. So
Correct.
New entrants to climate, and also funders that are just, there's so much data out there. I have no idea where to begin. This climate crisis is so overwhelming to me. So I want our listeners to keep these recommendations in mind, because it is certainly the case that we need broad-based messaging around the integratedness of all these problems as well. So it's like holding a both and approach to these these are not broad recommendations for what we as a globe need, but how funders can get their teeth in.
Yes, thank you for that. Because this is, setting the context. Again, maybe people are tuning in later. Like, there's all sorts of things for people to do that is very technical. We work on things on financial modeling. This is really specifically for an audience, for funders who are saying, I care about this, or I care about it a little, or I think I should care, but I don't know how to get involved, or I don't know what to do. And I think there is a lot of that. That may be surprising to your audience. People might think that people don't care. But from the funder's perspective, it really is just, how do I even get started? That is honestly what we have heard more than people would think, particularly from individual philanthropists, family foundations. The bigger corporate foundations have been grappling, and there's a whole different set of things that I'm happy to, we can get into some of that as well. But for philanthropists, data, one of the things when we look at this recommendation around data, this is true. This helps community-based groups get access to funding, because a lot of times they are supposed to have data, but nobody's funding their collection of data for them to be able to get grants. There's also data so that people are looking at facts that can help them with that. So it's really validating claims and showing what's happening. So making sure that some money goes to that. The fourth is really prioritizing long-term funding. So any of you out there who have gotten grant funding, you know what I'm talking about right here, the cycles that you have to be constantly asking for money. So to actually get the work done, we really urge funders, philanthropists to think about multi-year, long-term projects so people can really dig into it and get things done that you can actually measure what's happening and not be constantly fundraising. The fifth, which I've mentioned a couple times, is the different types of financial models. So that's the trust-based, unrestricted, et cetera. The sixth is really combining efforts whenever possible. So again, those funder collaboratives, we have a lot of examples of that. And that's something that I think philanthropists feel more comfortable giving when they have other people doing it with them. You're also able to give more when you have lots of different ones. You can also look at like if you have 25 different people all together in a group, and there's some sort of request for funding comes in, and maybe 5 of them are interested in it and the others aren't. But for the person applying for the grant, your chance of having somebody in that funding group, or maybe it's 5 who are all together, or maybe it's 15, but it's easier also for the person applying for the grant or the group applying for the grant. So it helps everybody. 7 is sharing learning with others. This seems like, you and I were talking about being moms before we started recording here. Learning to share. We as adults all the time hold on to things. Just share with your peers, your friends, your networks. We do this work and then nobody knows about it. So it's hard to grow and to build upon work that's already happening if you don't know about it. So really making sure that outcomes are put out there and shared, partner all the time. That helps everyone. 8 is the assuming, rather than assuming, ask. So really talk to the stakeholders about what it is they need. There's certainly some critiques of philanthropy are around people saying, I think you need this sort of thing, and I'm going to create a grant that's for this thing. And the community or the people who've been doing this work for decades are like, hey, we do not need that, or that's been done, or whatever it might be. So really just making sure you're talking with people. The 9th out of 10 is partnerships. So this is, a lot of times people don't fund, but is so needed, is capacity building, training, additional hiring. So it's, people expect frontline communities, small nonprofits to do all sorts of work without the staff to do it, without the infrastructure. So if you're looking at something, it's not a big company. They don't have a huge marketing department. They don't have data analysts, lots of things they may not have. So philanthropists can think about differently the way they fund. It's not just the money for a tree or, whatever the thing might be, but it is really allowing these groups that are doing the work to build their infrastructure to be more sustainable organizations and more effective organizations. The final recommendation of the 10 is balancing perspectives. So really understanding the skeptics, the activists, making sure that across political lines, which I know can be challenging at times. So really engaging with and understanding the whole ecosystem and how they work together. That sometimes means making hard choices. Sometimes it means things like encouraging people to work together, saying like, you know what, these two groups, just like funders may work together, sometimes groups may want to partner and work together. So if people can learn to communicate with each other and trust each other, then we can build better to have more effective work moving forward.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I do really encourage folks to check out the report because it's just expanding on those themes that you mentioned. One of the things that was so interesting to me in the report was there was a nod to the role of philanthropy in leveraging additional capital. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role of state and municipal governments and their commitments to climate right now and how we should hold that and how philanthropy can partner with that.
That is a great and very timely question. Thanks, Erin. So this is a question across a lot of different topics, not just environmental philanthropy, is how people can have access to capital beyond philanthropic capital. There is no way that philanthropy can make up for all the other types of capital that are out there. Governmental funding, you name it, investments, all that. It's philanthropy is really a bridge. So what we hope is doing things like you heard one of the points I mentioned earlier was about building capacity. So if a group has a bigger capacity, then they are able to then get access to other funding. So philanthropy should really be seen as sort of your first step, the door opening, the bridge building to getting more of those funds. In the current moment we're recording this now in March 2025, there's a big shift in federal funding is one main change. So people are now looking more to state-based and city-based funding. One of the things we are working with philanthropists to do is really think about how can you work at the state level. So you may care about a particular city or state, be from a particular city and state, whatever it may be, and to help unlock some of those funds that can be more state that may not be coming from the federal level the same way. The other thing I would say is this is the time for those who do have resources and capital, those of you listening who may be philanthropists, investors, you are needed more than ever right now. People are counting on and really need other sources of funds to keep their work going, let alone grow it. So this is the time and the moment to really have high impact. You also heard earlier, we were talking about venture philanthropy or impact investing. So for people who have access to that type of capital, maybe you're not doing more traditional philanthropy that way, but there's lots of ways that you can support organizations that are doing incredible work or that also have climate environment as central tenets to the work they're doing, even if they're not an explicitly climate or environment-based group. So yeah, really looking particularly now more than ever at ways to get capital flowing at regional, state level, not just philanthropic, what people are doing with private capital with their investments, because we definitely are seeing a different landscape and ability to access particularly federal funds around this work.
Yeah, amazing. And I just listened to, and we'll link it in the show notes, there's a global investigative news outlet, Manga Bay, and they just had a newscast that sort of highlighted where are we in terms of the longer arc of history and how different agencies have engaged with the climate movement, and highlighting that there might be new collaborations that emerge. And folks should listen to that Manga Bay podcast, but there might be new collaborations that emerge that have different levers that we haven't used up until now to facilitate that global collaboration on climate.
For sure. Yeah, we see a lot of that work where people are trying to look beyond national boundaries for lots of reasons and have those sort of collaborations. One thing I actually want to reflect back to, I briefly mentioned in the beginning, one of our projects around agritech, around green energy, and we were working with primarily innovators in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things with that specific program, while it's philanthropic dollars that funded it from the Motsepe Foundation, what it was really doing was creating and supporting organizations that had entrepreneurs building businesses that were around this so that they will hopefully be their own sustainable businesses. So those philanthropic dollars, some went to some nonprofits doing that work, but a lot of them were people who were saying, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and build and figure out a system that's going to work for my specific community, where I am, what business model works. We were doing all sorts of training for business modeling, how you get access to different types of capital, et cetera, with this program, so that this is also a different route to do things where it is funding a program that then builds entrepreneurs who are then building in their particular context.
Well, Next Economy Now listeners will be very sympathetic to that, given the transformation of our economic system is really what this podcast is all about. And a lot of that has to do with the incredibly hard work of entrepreneurs on the ground, just figuring out new ways to meet folks' needs in their communities in these changing moments and times. So I'm really, really grateful that you've done work in that as well. And I guess, is there anything else that you would want to share with listeners at this time around your work, around the report, around ways that listeners can support you and your organization to continue to do this work?
Thank you for that. Well, I would say if anyone is a funder or knows funders, to just share and encourage them to give. And we are happy to talk and meet with people. Part of what we do is build strategies for people who are trying to figure out how to give. We have lots of work that is ongoing. So we would love people to stay in touch with us, whether it's social media. We're at Milken Institute. We also have a Milken Institute Strategic Philanthropy. We've got all of our stuff is free. We're a nonprofit, so our reports are free and available. We also do a lot of convenings for work. We interview people. I mentioned earlier, those key opinion leaders, our expert interviews. We are always looking for people that can help share their perspectives as we're building out our work. And then I would finally say just to stay hopeful. If we're not hopeful and we're not continuing the work, that's where things really stop. I still have hope. I still get out of bed every morning and believe that we can move forward when we're working together. The more we are communicating with each other, and particularly in my case, just figuring out how do we try to make the capital flow to people who are doing such amazing work. People are still doing work. Things are happening. We just have to keep going, even if it's a different route to getting funding, even if it's starting a different type of business, engaging in new technology, whatever it may be. We have to still continue to try to work together because it can be better and we must do better.
I really want to uplift what you're saying around hope. And I was recently fortunate to attend a philanthropic convening called Confluence Philanthropy, where Bayo Akomolafe was a speaker. He's a scholar and Nigerian that lives in India. And he actually really kind of, in light of what you're saying, requested that the 300 philanthropy practitioners that were at that gathering change their frame from a linear path of progress to staying with the emergence. And I think that goes hand in hand with the hope that you're mentioning, because there's lots of parables that kind of tell us we don't actually know what the ripple effect of a certain particular action or context means in terms of the longer arc of history. And so I think that hope is really important because humans, we have, my business partner, Phoenix, always reminds me, we have a negativity bias. It's built in, it's wired in our psychology. It's wired into our brain systems. And it can compromise our hopefulness to actually take advantage of opportunities as they arise, see the places where our best skills are suited to make the most of this moment. So I just really appreciate you ending on that and just wanted to kind of substantiate it a little bit that leaders like Bio are asking us to step up to this moment with that optimism and that curiosity and that emergence and not seeing this work as linear.
Yes, we need you. We need the builders. We need the doers. One of the most exciting things is working with these entrepreneurs around the world and seeing people who wake up, they see a major challenge. And we're talking, just massive, massive global challenges and say, well, I think I can do some part of it. And that the incredible things, you're talking about humans being hardwired for negativity. We're also hardwired for ingenuity. We're also hardwired for innovation. That's how we have survived. We create things. We adapt to things. We work together to build things. So for all of the other ways that we may tear each other down or tear the planet down, we also are able to go and people can be extremely resilient, helpful, innovative, all of those things. So I would say lean into that. I would also say don't wait for somebody else to do it. I think we often think, well, so-and-so is going to solve it. The government's going to solve it, or this person or that, or nobody's going to solve it. If you think, what's the bit that I can do? That's where working with community, frontline workers, entrepreneurs who wake up every day and they're the ones saying, here's this bit that I can do, and be around others who are doing that so that you are around a community. That's how we as a human community are going to do the part that we can do. Move capital where we can, build things where we can, change policy when we can, clean things up when we can, educate differently when we can. There's something that everyone can do. I think that part of the inspire others and find the thing that you can do and know that we're hardwired for innovation as well.
I know I asked you to have the last word, but I wanted to just, again, express gratitude and acknowledge one thing about the report that I'd love our listeners to take to heart. Don't assume, ask. So with this hopeful momentum of taking action, what I really appreciated about the report is acknowledging the humility around really listening to the communities that are most affected, because yes, it's a global crisis. The climate crisis is a global issue. And there are communities that right now are feeling it more acutely than others. And so don't assume, ask. I just want to lift that up and appreciate the wording of that, the encouragement to stay humble, stay curious, and we all have a lot to learn from each other. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show today, Emily, and would love to stay in touch and keep collaborating. Really appreciate your work.
Great. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for listening. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation and are looking to dive even deeper into the B Corp movement, you'll love our new podcast, Beyond the B, hosted by Lyft Economy's Amy Allison and me, Ryan Honeyman. Beyond the B is your insider's guide to the B Corp movement. You'll learn about the new B Corp standards shaping our community, how the B Corp movement is navigating the various tensions and challenges of growth, and how businesses like Patagonia are putting their commitments to people and planet in practice. Check out our latest episodes and free resources at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can also subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening.